The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the second chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. The Gospel of the Lord. So as the year begins, I am getting ready for my annual continuing ed event, which, as many of you know, combines a theological conference with skiing in the Rocky Mountains. The name of this event has changed a couple times over the year, but as we discussed this in finance a number of years ago, we simply referred to it as the ski boondoggle, and that seems to work pretty well. I always look forward to this trip, and I actually do always learn things when I am at this continuing ed event, but it is also great to just be able to be in the mountains, to spend some time skiing with friends, and to generally relax after Christmas and before Lent begins. But even before I discovered the theological conference at Winter Park, I had been going there for years to ski with friends. And one of the things that I used to notice immediately as I got up into the mountains, even more than I do now, is that at night you can actually see stars, unlike around here where the light pollution pretty much blends out everything. Over the years, the light pollution has increased on the Front Range as well, but even today, for the first couple of nights after I get up in the mountains, I can notice the stars. I look up and I go, wow, this is really cool. But in spite of the impression that the stars make on me, after I'm in the mountains for 3 or 4 or 5 days, I stop noticing them. They become part of the normal background. And maybe because I don't really pay attention to the lack of stars around here, and since I stopped noticing them after I'm in the mountains for a few days, I wonder if I would have noticed this special star in the east had I lived in the time of these wise men. I suspect that that star, or meteor, or whatever it was that these wise men saw, went unnoticed by almost everybody in the first century. After all, only Matthew mentions it, and even when the wise men get to Jerusalem and ask Herod and the temple officials about the star that they've seen, absolutely nobody goes, "Oh, wow, yeah, that star. We wondered what that was all about." No one had noticed this at all. Probably the star that the wise men saw was not all that big or bright. And after all, stars were part of the regular background of everyday life for them as well. You know, I love to go looking at those dark sky photos that you can find on the web that you can see the entire Milky Way and go, wow, this is cool. And I think to myself, man, if I lived like that every night where the moon wasn't out, I would be looking at that and just be amazed. But probably I wouldn't. Probably after a while it would just be the normal thing and it would fade into the background. It was probably in the background of life for most people. They would not have noticed one little itty-bitty extra star. Stars for people in the first century were open to lots of interpretations, even among people who expected them to be the sign of something. You know, these wise men, as we translate it, the Greek word is magoi, from which we get the English word magician. These were astrologers. These were guys, they were not kings, or at least not according to the Bible. They were people who looked at the stars and essentially told people's horoscope by the reading of the stars. And like horoscopes, a lot of those interpretations, you are probably best to ignore and not believe any of them. They could mean anything. And most importantly, and this is important as we read the story from Matthew, stars for Jews meant nothing. There is absolutely nothing in the Bible about a star heralding the birth of the Messiah. When the wise men get to Jerusalem and they say, "Where's the king who has been born?" The kid who has been born, king of the Jews, because we saw his star, Herod and the temple officials completely ignore the part about the star, and they focus on the king. Who is somebody who's going to threaten Herod's throne? And they make the connection between king and Messiah and say, okay, now we're going to look for where the Bible says the Messiah is going to come from, and that's how they come up with Bethlehem. But it has nothing to do with stars. And yet, somehow, these pagan wise men from the East saw something. They first of all noticed that star, and they saw something that nobody else did. So what was different about these guys? What made them take notice in a way that apparently nobody else did? Maybe it was not the star itself, because it probably wasn't that big or bright or unusual. Perhaps for these guys the difference was that they were willing to seek God, however it was that they understood God, in a place that didn't seem religious to others. They were people who saw God's work in stars which everybody else most other people in the context around them would have gone, that's not God, that doesn't seem all that spiritual or religious to us. Stars were religious to them, but not to Jews, and not to many other pagans. Maybe for these guys, the difference was that they were looking towards the future instead of simply instant gratification. That is, not just what is God doing for me today, but what is God doing in the next few days, or not in the next few days, but in the next few years or decades. What's God doing in the long run? They were looking for that because they knew somehow they were seeking a baby, and that it would be decades before anything big happened because of this. And yet they saw the beginning of something big happening in the future. And maybe for these guys too, the difference was that they were willing to invest themselves in a journey, not fully knowing where it would lead or how long it would take to get there. Matthew's gospel suggests that they may have been on this journey for 2 years, because the next part of this story is where Herod goes and kills all the babies born within the last 2 years, based on the wise men saying, we've been following this star for 2 years now. So maybe one of the reasons that Matthew includes this story in the gospel, because these guys come out of nowhere and we never hear from them again, that's like a lot of people in the Bible. So maybe one of the reasons he spends almost a whole chapter worrying about these guys is that he wants to remind us that sometimes for us too, experiencing how God is working in our lives, seeing the revelation of God in our lives, and being part of what God is doing means acting a little bit like even these pagan astrologers from the East. And that doesn't necessarily mean looking to the stars and reading horoscopes, but it often does mean being willing to look for the stars that God puts in our lives. Where are the places that God is at work that do not look like religious signs to others, or maybe even to us? How do we experience God's call to get up and get moving in our real, everyday world? And how do we keep those normal things and normal events from just becoming part of the background noise in our lives? The word Epiphany, which this whole series of Sundays is going to be called Sundays After Epiphany, means revelation or manifestation. And this first story reminds us that God may be revealing himself to us in ways that are not big or bright or flashy, and that sometimes get lost in the background. One of the things about this story is that the wise men saw a sign of God doing something, God calling to them through something that didn't particularly seem religious or spiritual to other people. And sometimes a big temptation for us, at least I know this is for me too, is that I see something, I hear something, I suspect something's going on in my life, but it doesn't seem religious, it does not seem spiritual. but maybe that's God's way of calling me to, hey, pay attention to this and move in this direction. Sometimes that is the star. How do we not miss those stars? Sometimes for us too, being like these wise men means looking towards the future instead of what's going to happen tomorrow. You know, we sometimes get so caught up in the problems of right now and what's happening today and what's happening tomorrow, and oh my gosh, that we don't see or think about or invest ourselves emotionally in what God may be preparing us for, and what God may be pointing us to that's going to happen years or even decades from now. And that can be especially challenging at the beginning of a new year, when in spite of the fact that lots of us have thought about, what's my resolution for the next year? What am I going to work towards, for the next 12 months? But frankly, if you're like me, I'm just desperately trying to get caught up on the stuff that I got behind on during the holiday season. I'm working on last year's stuff still before I can even think about what's happening today, let alone a year from now, 10 years from now. But some of the things that we're supposed to be looking for as we're looking for God's revelation in our lives is what God is preparing us for, not just tomorrow and not just next week, but how's God guiding us forward in the next years and decades. And for us too, being like these wise men often means investing ourselves in journeys that may take longer than we think, and where the end of the journey is not entirely mapped out. Like the wise men, do we need to consider different roads from the ones that got us to where we are now? See, that's the thing about this story. The roads that brought the wise men to Jesus were absolutely appropriate roads. That's how they were supposed to get there. But then they get warned in this dream, hey, you need to go home by a different route. How do they do that? Where do they go? And what do they do once they get home? Matthew doesn't tell us. And maybe Matthew doesn't tell us because that's the question he's asking us. Having had an experience of Jesus in your life, now where do you go? What do you do with that? How do you share that? How do you get to that next place? How are you open to God's calling and God's direction in your life for the next stage, for the next chapter? You know, the stars that God puts before us each day may not be big, bright, or flashy stars depicted on some of our Christmas cards where there's this glowing beam going, Yong. Instead, the story of the wise men reminds us that God is often guiding us and pointing us forward through stars that may get lost in the background if we're not careful to look for them. The story of the wise men reminds us that God is often guiding us and pointing us forward through the kinds of stars that lead us to think longer term than what's happening today or tomorrow. And the story of the wise men reminds us that the stars God is using to guide us and lead us forward are never calls to focus on the stars themselves, but rather to focus on the journey into the future to which Jesus is leading us. Amen.